Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to the Tinbergen Lecture 2024. Yeah, so my name is Robert Deur and I'm the president of the Royal Dutch Economic Association, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Tinbergen Lecture 2024, and a special welcome, of course, to Professor Pol Antràs, who will deliver the Tinbergen Lecture this year. Yeah, so as you know, and many of you have experienced, the Tinbergen Lecture is part of the Nederlandse Economendag, the annual conference where we get together to talk about policy matters, to learn about new academic research findings, and in particular to get together and, share insights. And there's also a bit of, nice informal get-togethering, of course, as well. Now, and this year is kind of a special year for the association because we are celebrating that we now exist for 175 years. So that's quite an achievement, I would say. And earlier this year, we had already a really nice economics festival in Rotterdam, 3 days long, where we celebrated the anniversary. And yeah, we're really glad today to get together with so many of you. We have today, I heard the latest number, over 430 economists. It's a record number and we're super proud of it. Now, what we also really like is to be here again at this beautiful campus of Leiden University. We're in The Hague, but this is part of Leiden University. And we have been here now for, I believe, the 4th time or something like that, at this beautiful location. And we're very grateful for the hosting. And yeah, I also would like to welcome a number of people who follow the live stream that still exists. So also welcome economists at home and who later watch the video. Yeah, and as this conference has increased in size, actually it has doubled in size. Also, the organizing committee of the conference has doubled in size. Nevertheless, I would like to invite them all to come on stage so that we can show our gratefulness to them. So please, the members of the 2024 Nederlandse Economendag Committee, please come to the floor. Yeah, I don't know. If you also want to be on camera, then you better stand there, actually. It's okay like this. Yeah. So let me also mention your name. So Emma Brinkman, who is actually at the desk downstairs, so please say thank you to her later. Guus Brouwer, Nicoleta Tjurila, Nienke Cornelissen, Ron Dieris, Emiel Evenhuis, Elian Griffioen, Dorian de Gruyter, Jesse Kremer, Maartje Schultz, Heike Vethaak, Sakura de Vries, Edwin van der Werf, George van Wickeren, and the committee was chaired by Annemiek Verrips. Please, another warm applause for them. Yeah, so we have flowers for you all, but there's no time to hand them out personally right now, so I will do that later. But I would like to make one exception, and that's actually for you, Annemiek. The chair of the committee, and this is the 4th time that you have chaired the committee, and it will also be your last. Yeah, and that makes us a bit sad, but we are also, super grateful for all these years that you have led the Nederlandse Economendag committee. I vividly remember the first time that you led the committee. It was in the midst of COVID. And we had discussions about whether or not we could get together. It was in 2021. In the end, it seems a responsible thing to do to get together. And we were here in the room next door, right, with about 300 people. There was really a great vibrance in that year. I think some of you were also there. And it was after a long time that we were working from home and had online conferences and stuff. And so people were super happy to see each other again in real life, but we were all also a bit nervous by that time. And still, when I think back of it, we can still feel a bit the nervousness. Actually, a week later, after the conference, a lockdown was announced. No, there was, of course, just a correlation, no causal effect here, but yeah, and now in the years that followed, because this is the 4th year that you have led the committee, the conference has, well, increased in size, increased in number of topics being discussed. It has become richer and better, and there's more excitement than ever, and we are super grateful to you for having run the committee for so many years, Annemiek. So, yeah, as a token of appreciation, we have bought a special set of flowers for you, which is over there. And we also have a present for you. And now I have to be careful not to give the macabre plate to you, because the presents look quite alike, but I think this is the one. There you go. Yeah, so we created like a collage with pictures. So we searched for like the nicest pictures of the Nederlandse Economendag in the last 3 years. Okay. Now you will recognize some of the pictures because actually they were made by you. But never, we hope you will like it, and that from time to time you will think back about the years when you were running the Nederlandse Economendag, and there you go. Thank you, Annemiek. All right. Yes, please take a seat. Oh, take care. All right. Then we go to the Tinbergen lecture. And we are extremely pleased to have Professor Pol Antràs to give the Tinbergen lecture this year. Pol Antràs is Professor of Economics at Harvard University, where he has been in the last 20 years. He was born in Barcelona, where he also did his bachelor and master at Pompeu Fabra, and after that he moved to MIT to do a PhD. Now, ever since, he has been extremely influential in the profession. He has made numerous seminal contributions to the discipline, and of course, in particular, in the area of international economics. Now, in his work, he puts firms at the center stage of the analysis, rather than sectors or countries, as was usual in the traditional analysis in international economics. And contractual frictions play a crucial role in his models. And they enable us to better understand the patterns of international trade as well as the way it is organized. Now, in more recent work, Pol has studied how global value chains have affected international trade flows and the production patterns, and in this context, he has also addressed the question of whether we have actually entered in a phase of deglobalization. Now, and I think until now the answer is a no. So globalization has slowed down. It's not going as fast as it used to be. And so the term slowbalization, right, which I learned about this morning. But who knows what is ahead of us, because protectionism is on the rise and may rise even further in the near future. And so maybe deglobalization will become a fact of life in the not so distant future. Now, about this and also other topics, Pol will talk today with the title of his lecture, Shaping the World Economy in the Age of Global Value Change. So it's a pleasure and honor to give you the floor. Pol Antràs.
Thanks, thanks a lot, Robert. It's a deep, deep honor to be here. I'm deeply honored to be here to deliver the Tinbergen lecture. Can everybody hear me? I was sitting there and, yeah? There's a little bit of an echo.
Yeah, there is. Normally with lectures we switch it off, but I'm not sure if it's on.
Okay. I'll try to speak up. I have a little bit of a sore throat, but hopefully you can hear me. Okay, so as Robert was saying, I'll speak about shaping the world economy in the age of global value chains. Okay, there you are. But before I get started, obviously this is a very special lecture. So I spent the last few weeks thinking about how what I do might be connected to Tinbergen's work, and how, if he had been around, how I would have benefited from his views on the topic. Obviously, we all know of him as one of the founders of econometrics, and I think that's his most famous work. But he was also an international economist, and he wrote, particularly in the later years, about international trade. As far as I can tease out from my reading of his work, particularly his work Shaping the World Economy, from which I unshamefully borrowed my title, I think he embraced neoclassical theories of trade. He saw the power in them, but he also understood that trade had significant consequences for inequality. He also understood that trade had significant consequences for national security, that specialization came with its dangers. So it's still a very insightful author to study. For those of you that are trade economists, you might have been wondering, why hasn't he mentioned the gravity equation? And indeed, to us trade economists, he's perhaps most famous for being the first economist to run the so-called gravity equation, which is, this is a copy and paste from Appendix 6 of Shaping the World Economy, where he talks about possibly the idea of running bilateral trade flows in a log linear form on measures of the GDP of the exporting country, the GDP of the importing country, and distance. Now, modern trade theories provide a lot of theoretical reasons why that's exactly what you want to be running, but he just came up with it, and his intuition had led him to this equation. And there's thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of papers that have been written based on this. Anyway, I'll come back to some of these insights as I go along, but having gone through this, I felt much better about, okay, yes, I can see a connection now between some of the things that I'll say and his work. But let me tell you a bit more narrowly what I plan on doing in the next, is it now 57 or whatever minutes? You'll tell me. I want to start by not taking for granted that you know what global value chains are. I'm going to go from basics, and I'm going to give you a very broad introduction to what we mean as economists, what we mean by global value chains. Then I'm going to briefly review some work with a heavy bias on my own work, but rather than going tediously over the papers, I just want to give you a broad sense of what are the challenges that we're facing in this literature, and how are we coping with them? What are some of the solutions we've come up with? And then in the process, but more towards the end, I'm going to try to outline some areas of future work, which is a polite way of saying areas where I think we have it wrong at this point, that there's much room for improvement. And then if there's time, and I hope there will be time, I do want to touch upon policy issues. I realize that some of you are academics, some of you are coming from the policy world. Maybe the policy analysis underlying this lecture is a little bit less developed than other things that I'll talk about, but it's important that I leave some time for that. So, Robert, if I have 5 minutes left and I haven't gotten there, do start waving your arms, okay? Okay, let's go. So let's do that. Let me just give you a word of warning, which is, even though a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about connect with special real-life situations, and I'll try to explain this. Obviously, if I talk about challenges and solutions, I'm going to delve into somewhat technical matters. There'll be no math, but some of what I want to tell you about is somewhat technical in matter, but I will try to cover it at a high level, so not to lose many people, okay? As a matter of background, I'm coming in as a trade economist. It's a very old field in economics. It's at least 200 years old. Some of us think about David Ricardo's work as the foundation of the field, the creation of the concept of comparative advantage. And at some level, we understand why countries are trading with each other. But why I'm here telling you about global value chains is because when I look at the workhorse models in the field, and I'll tell you a bit more about that as we go along, and I compare it to what I see in the modern world economy, I still see a bit of disconnect, okay? In particular, workhorse trade models, although some of them would feature what we call intermediate input flows, to a large extent, they still focus on this idea that countries might consume goods, consumers in various countries might consume goods that are not produced in their countries. So I, living in the US, might be able to enjoy some Gouda cheese when I import it from the Netherlands, okay? But in reality, the way that I think about the world economy, yes, of course, is trading Gouda cheese, but I'd like to think about the trade economy somewhat differently. And I do so because of developments that happened since the late 1980s or mid-1980s that basically led to a fairly dramatic reorganization of production processes worldwide, where more and more firms started using parts and components or rely on foreign suppliers in their production process. There's various reasons why this happened in that time period. I don't have time to delve into it, but there were technological factors that contributed to them. There were regional trade agreements that contributed to that. China, the emergence of China, contributed to that. So there was a bunch of forces that basically led firms to rethink what they were doing and started organizing production at the global scale. I would argue that the richness of these decisions is not well captured by standard models, and that has led to a new wave of work on this so-called global value chains. Now, when you try to push for a new conceptual framework, you're obviously going to have to think about abstractions, like broad frameworks that are going to capture certain aspects of this phenomena. And in that sense, what I've found useful in my own work is building on a taxonomy that Richard Baldwin and Tony Venables suggested in an article a few years ago, which is to think about broadly two types of global value chains. Some that we call spiders, and some that we call snakes. So let's start with spiders, okay? And I told you I'm going to start very basic, okay? So I'm going to start with figures. What is a spider? That's a spider, okay? We all know that. Sorry if I scare some of you. But what do we mean of a spider? It's basically going to be a production process that has a natural core, okay? Think about the assembly process, for instance, and then there's a bunch of legs that converge to that process. And it's a global value chain in the sense that the legs of this spider are so long that they're actually crossing borders. We're bringing the inputs from very far. More tangible example in terms of manufacturing would be the production of the Dreamliner, Boeing's Dreamliner, which, as you know, is an American product. It's assembled in the northwest of the US and then exported worldwide. And we typically, in our undergrad textbook, we use it as an example of strategic trade policy. The US competing against Europe, the Airbus, in selling planes. But it's been estimated that about 70% of the parts in the Dreamliner, they're actually coming from abroad. For instance, the engines, part of them are coming from the UK. You have the wings are coming from Japan. The wingtips are coming from Korea. There's a bunch of legs that are converging into this core in Washington State, US, to create this good. So when the US exports airplanes, it's going to be selling this aircraft, but they're going to be, those planes are going to be embodying a lot of not just US value added, but Korean value added, Japanese value added, British value added. That's one example. Let me give you another example, another spider, or rather a web of spiders, for reasons that I'll get to, which is the auto industry. Okay, so I have an example here. It's the Ford F-150. Okay, for those of us that live in the US and that occasionally like to watch American football, I'm not sure I recommend it, but if you were to watch it, they would have these commercials with someone with a very deep voice telling you about the F-150, which is one of these pickup trucks, and saying how Ford is 100% committed to being 100% assembled in the US. Now, the word assembled actually does a lot of lifting here, in the sense that if you, and you should always read the fine print says assembled of foreign and domestic parts. Indeed, only about 55% of the value of the F-150s is US value added. Okay? In addition, this is the F-150. No European in their right minds would want to buy this thing. Right? So this is a car that is mostly sold in the US, but Ford produces a bunch of cars that are much more appealing to European consumers. And indeed, it makes those vehicles, but it doesn't make them in the US. It doesn't assemble them in the US. For instance, there's a plant in Valencia, close to Barcelona, where I'm from, that produces a bunch of Fords for the European market. Indeed, it's not just this Valencia plant, they have a bunch of plants worldwide. Only about 40% of Ford vehicles are assembled in the US. Okay? So maybe the commercials should say, 40% committed to America, and not even quite because of this. So that would not work. But the point is that even for Ford, clearly what they have is this model where they bring parts and components into assembly plants, but it's a web of spiders. These assembly plants are actually worldwide. Okay, so how about snakes? Well, that's a snake. What do we mean by a snake? A snake is going to be a global value chain, which again is going to combine value added in various countries, but it's processes where we think that about just thinking about an assembly stage and the inputs flowing in is too restrictive, because we want to think about the multi-stage nature of these processes, where it's not just inputs and assembly, but there's a sequence of stages that are well defined, maybe by engineering constraints, and you really want to think about how stage 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, how you're going to locate them in different countries in the world. Nice example, I think, is, and timely one, is semiconductors, where it's very clear that you need some raw materials, silicon. The silicon needs to be purified. With the big cylinders of silicon, you have the wafers, the wafer fabrication process, which is the core of the industry. That's cut into smaller chips. It's sent to the assemblers, and from there to the end consumers. And that's a sequence of stages that have to happen one after the other in a sort of vertical manner. And one might think, well, if I think about global trade as transactions that happen to cross a border, but they're part of a much bigger chain that has gone through some stages and is going through further stages down the line, is this something that I should take into account when I look at customs forms in a country? Now, obviously, spiders and snakes, it's a very restrictive way to think about that. And, realistically, you might want to think about something like a hybrid of both, okay? Don't worry, I'm not going to put a scary thing here, okay? You could have anticipated this. I could see some faces looking like, what about ASML, right? I mean, that's part of semiconductors, and you don't have it there. Indeed, it's a way more complex than just a spider. When the wafer fabrication receives the silicon cylinders, they also need the machines to operate them, right? So it's obviously, there's many legs that are converging at every node of a snake. Or and if you think about in spiders, the legs of the spiders, they're snakes, okay? So it's basically in car production, you have the parts that come into the factory, but to get those parts, you've had to go through a sequence of stages. To produce the chassis, you're going to need steel frame. To produce the engine, you're going to need aluminum and other goods. So obviously, all these sort of inputs go through a sequence of processes. So the world is more complicated, but sometimes it's worth starting from basic models that abstract from some dimensions and getting some insights. Do you still hear me in the back? I do hear the echo. Wow. Okay. All right, so let me take stock. I need to kind of get into substance. The main point that I want to convey, and I'm going to try to convey it through specific insights, is that we live in a world in which trade is not Ricardian trade of let's exchange wine for cloth, and that more and more when we get data from customs forms, what we're really seeing is just slices of these global value chains. It's some transactions that are part of much bigger global value chains that at that point in the chain just happen to cross a border. And that begs the question of whether we can treat these different slices as independently determined from the other slices. And I would argue that this is the key new aspect of this body of work. Not that there's input trade or not, but that there are many transactions that are connected. And this is not about connections that are general equilibrium connections, which trade theory is all about, or industry equilibrium connections of competition effects or anything like that. These are firm-level interdependencies that firms are collaborating, they're working together in a given chain that is spanning many transactions worldwide. To give you a specific example, I told you that the wings in the Dreamliner were coming from Nagoya in Japan, and the wingtips were coming from Busan in Korea. Do we really think that those imports are independent from each other? Last I checked, we need one-to-one ratio, right? So you'd imagine that these transactions will be correlated somehow. So maybe we want to think about this. Some of you, and I've been in a session today, obviously there's a body of work that has been thinking about this. I'm not just stepping in and telling you something that most people don't know. It's a very active area of research. It's been overviewed by a number of authors. I have my own handbook chapter with David Chor, if you're curious to dig a little bit deeper in that area. We offer in that paper a broad overview of the field, and we divide it into kind of 5 main areas. 2 areas on the empirical front and 2 areas on the theoretical front. On the empirical front, we distinguish between macro approaches, okay, which is trying to measure this idea that when countries export goods, they use foreign value added, but they do so still in this old tradition of thinking of trade at the country/industry level, something that Robert very nicely described before. And that's the main output of this work is what we call the world input-output tables. Okay, of one particular example is what the good folks in Groningen have come up with, which is the World Input-Output Database, which I would describe as one of the, if not the most careful attempt at constructing a world input-output table. I'll come back to that. I have my own qualms about it. I think there's limitations with it, but they really work really hard at that. There's other folks that don't take a macro approach. They take more of a firm-level approach, which is, if at the end of the day, what we want to understand is the interconnections between the wings and the wingtips, we really want to think at the firm level, okay? Now, that's harder, and I'll get to that later, but you really want to measure things at the firm level, maybe with customs-level information, maybe with information on the same company in different markets, okay? So those are the so-called firm-level studies. On the theoretical front, there's a similar dichotomy. There's folks that have produced macro models with intermediate input trade and with foreign value added in exports. And those models, so-called roundabout models, caliendo parro for those that are in the literature, they are nice because they speak very much to world input-output tables. There's a nice match between the two. And there's folks that have used input-output analysis to look at counterfactuals. If you have that trade barrier, you have that trade agreement, there's decoupling in the paper I saw earlier today, how our value chain is going to be reorganized in the sense of how value added at the country industry level is going to be shifting across countries. Similarly, there's approaches that are after the same questions, but they understand that if you want to understand how value added is going to move across countries and industries, you might want to think about how that's going to be shaped by firm-level decisions as to where firms are going to import these places or set up plants in other places. So it's similar goals, but starting at the micro level. Finally, there's obviously work on policy. We seek policy relevance, so there's folks that are trying to tease out how we should design policies in the age of global value chains. And that's, I think, much more at its infancy, and I have some slides on this at the end, but it's mostly about words of warning rather than specific recommendations, okay? And words of warning related to the policies that I've seen being rolled out or being proposed in recent months, okay? So that's the broad literature, but I'm biased in my own work, and I want to spend most of my time telling more specifically about my own work. I have done a bit of macro work, but most of my work, as Robert anticipated, is at the firm level. I'm a firm believer that there's much we can learn from working a bit harder and trying to understand firm behavior. We can speak to the macro because we can still aggregate those firm-level decisions into aggregates, okay? So this builds on, obviously, Mark Mellitz's seminal work on exporting, which showed the power of thinking about country-level exporting, or country industry-level exporting, as being the aggregation of firm-level decisions as to whether export or not. Okay, so you had a framework where firms were selecting into selling to some markets, but not others, and then showing how you can aggregate those models and they're amenable to a quantification. Where I depart from Melitz's work, or at least his original work, is in acknowledging that the export decision is just one of many decisions that firms make when operating at a global scale. Some of my early work, as Robert was, you anticipated everything. I don't know. It was that I've been thinking hard about organizational decisions in models with contractual frictions. I'll say nothing about that today, okay? But there's other layers of decisions that firms make when they're global firms. They not only export, but they import. When Boeing is deciding where to get the wings from, it's also deciding the source of those wings. That's an importing decision. When Ford decides to produce cars like the Ford Fiesta, produce it in Europe, say in Valencia, that's making a decision on where to set up for an assembly. Those are decisions that firms make that are going to shape trade flows. Other stuff that is relevant for GVCs, I'm not going to talk about it today, but obviously contractual frictions, customization, search and matching frictions. There's a bunch of things that when you think about input trade and value chains, they become particularly relevant because they tend to be longer-term relationships. That's all very interesting, but I'm not going to touch much upon it. But obviously, the frameworks that I'll tell you about are still going to be too simple in that they're going to abstract from many things that many of you might think are relevant. But the key question this literature has been after is basically, okay, the world is more complicated than our models, but does it matter? Okay, can we think about models of this that incorporate those features, and at the end of the day, are we going to end up with the same predictions, the same counterfactual predictions? If so, yeah, you can write down the more complicated models, but it's not going to be clear that it's worth your while. So the main thing is the novel does a lot of work here, which is what's new? What are the new ideas, the new insights that come out of this framework? So there's new insights in many people's work, but I'm going to emphasize my own work here in work of spiders, my work with Ford and Tintelnot, the work on snakes, some of the work that I did with Alonso de Cortari. There's frameworks of snipers combining things, so my work with Fadiv and Ford and Tintelnot would fall on that. There's some work on the trade policy in the world of GVCs, so that's work with Gutierrez, Tintelnot, and Ford. And then I've been doing recently a bit more esoteric stuff, I would say. At least that's how the referees describe it, which is thinking about interest rates and production length and how they shape specialization. I didn't stop to say it, but the semiconductors example had this note that says it takes 100 days to produce a chip. And I think that for no small reason, that's because it's such a global process that things are in transit a long time. So I have some slides on that, but I'm sure I'll run out of time. So what do I want to do now? I'm not going to go one by these papers, don't worry. I'm not here to bore you. But I do want to distill some of the insights of these papers, both in terms of what are the theoretical challenges that we faced in writing those papers, and how did we solve them, and what are the empirical challenges of trying to do empirical work at the firm level, and how did we try to kind of push forward. So in terms of theoretical challenges, this is where I need to get a little bit technical for a second, but I need to remind you how the benchmark workhorse Melitz framework works. This is a model in which you have industries that are populated by firms, and firms are heterogeneous in their productivity or in the appeal of their products to consumers, something that generates variation in profitability across firms. There's demand for their products in their home market, but there's demand for their products in other markets. So firms are facing this decision of, do I sell to my local market only, or do I also sell to the foreign market? Let me give you an example, which is the Ford plant in Valencia. Well, Valencia is really here, but I couldn't fit it here. So let me put the plant here. It's producing cars. Are they going to sell it to the Spanish market, or are they going to pay some cost, be able to sell to the French market, pay another cost, sell to the Italian market? Okay, so it's making these decisions of where to sell these goods. A key assumption in those frameworks, one we don't often emphasize, is that even though these are models with scale economies, where average costs fall in quantities, the way that this scale economies are modeled goes back to Krugman, is a very special one, which is marginal costs are constant, there's just overhead costs. There's an entry cost, an overhead cost, a fixed cost of exporting. All that generates scale economies, but the marginal cost is maintained as being constant. Now that does a lot of work here because it basically allows you to treat these exporting decisions as independent from each other. Whether this plant is going to export to this market or that market has no bearing on the decision in the other market. There's no spillovers in these decisions. So if there's n countries in the world, I face n 0, 1 decisions. Okay, so it's very simple to solve these models and aggregate them. A small tangent, I spent quite a bit of time doing these figures, okay? Obviously, I thought, why am I doing this? I should just get ChatGPT to do this for me. And then I realized we're not there yet. So this is what ChatGPT came up with. I asked very nicely, could you please help me do this? I don't think they got the memo that things didn't work out for Napoleon. Anyway, so that's the exporting decision. I'm from Spain, so I had to make this joke. That's a firm level decision of exporting. Some of this literature is saying, okay, can we think about an analogous way to think about spiders, this idea of Boeing bringing inputs and using them for production? And it sort of seems plausible that you might also want to think about firms in industries that are heterogeneous in their capabilities. They might value sourcing inputs from foreign markets to reduce their marginal costs, but maybe some firms are going to be in a better position to amortize those fixed costs than other firms. So maybe some firms are going to import from many markets, others from less. Some firms might only be able to use local suppliers. So there's an analogy here, but there's a big difference, which is in these models, treating the marginal cost as constant is a non-starter. Because the reason you're offshoring is precisely to reduce your marginal cost. If I think about example of the Ford plant, I gave up on ChatGPT here already. I'm like, okay, I'm just going to do this myself. Maybe this plant is going to want to bring seats from Romania, I think. This is Romania, I think, yeah. And then engines from Germany, okay? But the decision of whether they're going to go and try to get the seats from Romania is going to be a function of how many cars they're going to. It's kind of expensive to engage in business there. So they're going to want to make sure they have enough sales to do that. So the sales are going to come from competitive pricing. The competitive pricing is going to come from a good cost. So the fact that they're buying engines from Germany that are going to make the cars more powerful, maybe it's going to foster sales. It's going to reduce the effective marginal cost of delivering high-quality cars. So these decisions are related. It's the same as with the Nagoya versus Busan, the wings. They're clearly related. If Boeing reduces the cost of the wings, they're going to produce more planes. They're going to want more wingtips. It's just very clear that these are related. Mathematically, that basically means that a problem which was a 0-1 decision for n markets, just focusing on sourcing is a 2 to the power j problem, where if you know anything about combinatorial stuff, as j grows, this sort of blows up in your face very quickly. It becomes, you're choosing a set of countries rather than 0-1 countries. So, that's not something that is new. That's something that early in the 2000s, when I was working on models of sourcing, I realized very quickly. And what did I do? What most economists do when they face something like that? They run away. Okay, I ran away, and my early work is 2-country models. Now I can handle 4, okay? But then you have kids, you become patient, and you come back to these problems that you had run away. And I'll tell you a bit that it's actually something one can tackle. It's also more complicated. It's not just the decision of, do I get the seats from Romania or from Spain, but also I need to figure out how much I want to demand of those seats. How many seats do I need? How many seats I need, it's going to be a function of how many cars I'm going to produce. How many cars I'm going to produce, it's going to be a function of my price, which is a function of the marginal cost, which is a function of the cost that my suppliers are giving me. So even it's not just an extensive, what we call an extensive margin combinatorial problem, but also the intensive margin is much more complicated than in export models, okay? So I'll come back to why there's hope. But let me first pile up the challenges. So forget about global sourcing for a second, But think about Ford again, but think about the global assembly strategy. The fact that I had Ford Valencia, but that's an American company. So it has a plant in Valencia because it decided to become multinational, but it has multiple plants. And when a firm like Ford is deciding where to set up assembly plants, that firm also faces a much more complex problem than a firm deciding a 0-1 decision as to whether I have a plant in a country or not. The interdependencies there are somewhat different. Just let me illustrate them graphically. You started with the exporting decision, okay? But now Ford might be thinking, maybe we want to have a plant in Germany too, like they do. And then you might worry about cannibalization effects, which is the profitability of opening the German plant might be lower than in the absence of the Spanish plant because these plants are competing for the same consumers. So obviously, they're eating each other's market share. So that would be a situation in which, from the point of view of Ford, this opening up these plants are substitutes. They kind of reduce each other's incentive to do so. And many models would give you that feature. But there's also situations where you might actually have complementarity. Maybe the German plant and the Spanish plant, they're producing different models in different categories. They're not really competing with each other, but they might be sharing common suppliers. Maybe there's a tire supplier in Turkey, there's the Romanian car seat supplier, and those suppliers, we paid those fixed costs to set up our global value chains with them, but now they can sell to all our suppliers. So if I was operating in Spain, and I had that plant in Spain, using those suppliers, and if I open up now one in Germany, maybe I can use the same suppliers. So that's going to lead me to more efficiently operate, which is a force of complementarity. The profitability of opening new plants might be higher in areas where I've already opened plants that have created a complex supply chain network. No matter which side this complementarities, substitutabilities go, you can show that again, is not J01 decisions, is 2 to the power J. You're choosing a set of countries in which you're going to set up plants. And again, because J is large in the world economy, that is a very complex problem that you could typically not solve brute force. Third challenge, okay, and last challenge, excuse me, is it's related to snakes. Multi-stage and stages of production, one after the other. If there's no geographical features, no trade frictions, that's not all that relevant. It's not going to change matters too much. But in a world in trade costs, which is the world we live in, it makes things much harder. Now, even in the absence of scale economies, which were the source of much of the interdependencies that I was talking about, the decision of where to locate a stage in this chain is not independent of where other stuff is done. Let's go back to an example of Ford Valencia. It's selling cars to France. Obviously, we could think about different destinations of consumption. And it uses tires, okay? So the tires are coming from Turkey because maybe Ford identified a super efficient, low-cost provider of tires in Turkey. But tires are produced with rubber, partly. And rubber, I learned this in preparing this, Belgium is actually a big exporter of rubber. That was a surprise to me. So it's not crazy, okay? So the rubber is going to go from Belgium to Turkey, and then the tire from Turkey to Spain, and then the car. But that's not how Ford's going to want to make that decision. It's going to want to look at potential tire suppliers in other places. Maybe there's a tire supplier, if the clicker works, in Italy. It's not quite as efficient, low cost, as the Turkish one, but notice that we've dramatically cut on trade costs, right? Because the chain is much more local. So that's a bit of a silly example, but the point is broader, which is in thinking about where to locate stages of production in multi-stage production processes where geography matters, trade costs vary by distance, say, like Tinbergen was teaching us many years ago, then even with constant returns to scale, in which the problems I was laying out before disappear, you still have this super complex combinatorial problem, where now that's j to the power n. If j, n, or n are large, again, this is not something you're going to be able to solve in your computer. Okay? So how do we make progress here? Let me tell you briefly. I mean, I cannot go into the details, but hopefully if I've made you curious, you will. But in a nutshell, there's different types of approaches that have been used to kind of solve this. The first one is basically maintain other assumptions in workhorse models. We may like them or not, but we think about preferences, consumer preferences, as being represented by certain types of utility functions. Or we think about how inputs substitute with each other as being characterized by some functions. When you adopt the standard assumptions that we make in our field, it turns out that both in the global sourcing and in the global assembly entry decision problems that I was telling you about, you're in a situation where either the decisions are complements or substitutes. Either cannibalization effects dominate or complementarities effects dominate. So as long as these interdependencies all go in the same direction, it turns out that there's mathematical tools to solve this problem. So in AFT 2017, we borrowed from the monotone comparative statics literature, which is a theoretical literature. It's tied to Milgram, Athey, and others, but showed that the same tools had power in characterizing the solution of the problem, on average, what firms should do, but also in devising iterative algorithms that allow you to solve these problems very quickly. The same is true for Snikers when you kind of have both the spider but also the global assembly. It turns out that the same algorithms can typically work. Obviously, there's other approaches that are going to be needed if this strong, what we call single crossing properties, that you're always complements or substitutes, if those fail, and they will fail in many settings, there's folks that are pushing other approaches. I have students that have worked on linear programming. If you put more structure, you can use linear programming a la Koopman, which is another one of the Dutch Nobel Prize winners. I have a student now working on machine learning techniques to kind of solve these problems. So there's room. I mean, it might look daunting, but there's ways we can approach it. And that's good, because if you believe that there's much to be learned from thinking about firm-level decisions and aggregating them, you really need to have techniques to solve the firm-level problem. Aggregating the firm-level decisions, that's not hard. It's just adding up stuff. The computer will do that in an instant. But you really need to have models that characterize what firms do. Okay? In terms of the snakes, the problem of geography leading to sort of these path problems, my work with Alonso de Gortari shows that dynamic programming is very powerful there. Actually, you don't need to solve this super complicated problem. You could turn it into a set of stage problems. And there's recent work by students of mine that show that even with scale economies, the same is true. So that looks daunting, but less so. And then there's some subtle aspects of, once you've pinned down which countries you're operating with, which countries I have suppliers from, which countries I have an assembly plant from, which countries I export to, I still need to pin down the volumes, how much of all this I'm going to do. But there's tools to, starting with Ethan and Cordham, our field has borrowed tools from the discrete choice literature, dating back to McFadden. So we have a good handle on that. That should come to no surprise to most people versed in this. So at the end of the day, by now we have models which, akin to the exporting models, you can solve the firm-level problem, aggregate it up, and then estimate the model, estimate the parameters of the model that best fit a given world equilibrium, in which, again, customs forms would be capturing slices of those chains. Once you've estimated the models, you can play with them. I can say, okay, now I'm going to jack up this tariff, going to jack up that tariff, and let's see where the dust is going to settle. And the key thing is, when I play with the counterfactuals, am I going to get the same answers as traditional models? And if not, what are the answers going to get? So what are the lessons that we get from this? So let me start with the first lesson. How am I doing on time, Robert? Very good. Well, you don't know how much stuff I have. Okay, good. Not too bad. Okay, so theoretical lessons. Again, I encourage you to kind of dig deeper into the papers, but I'm going to try to highlight what I think is the more interesting things that come out of it. So the first is, remember I told you that this model starts with industries that are populated by firms that differ in their productivity or the appeal of their products. Okay, there's some have better brands than others. Well, all these models are going to tell you that through their sourcing decisions, through their exporting decisions, through their global assembly decisions, these productivity differences are magnified and generate sales differences that are orders of magnitude larger. And I think that's very important in understanding the sheer granularity of the data. With work that I've done in the US, I'll tell you a bit more about that because that's sort of an empirical paper, so it's going to connect to the empirical challenges. We are able to look at the importance of US domestic firms versus firms that operate in the US but they're part of multinationals, either because it's like Ford, they have affiliates abroad, or like Toyota because it's a Japanese company that has an affiliate in the US, or affiliates in the US. And you see that in the data, only about 25% of sales are domestic firms. Multinational firms account for 75% of domestic sales in the US. But there's only 1,500 of them. Super small number of firms account for the bulk of activity. This is across sectors, right? So per sector, you're not going to have many firms that are account for this. You see it in trade even more disproportionately. More than 80% of US imports, more than 80% of US exports is accounted for by a very small number of firms. If you understand what they do, you're done. No, you're not done, but you get a big chunk of the aggregates, which is why we might care for counterfactuals. And that, again, is tied to this idea that through scale economies, big firms are able to kind of leverage more these opportunities than small firms. Another thing that I emphasized is, that we've emphasized in our work, is that certain types of shocks, like import competition shocks, the so-called China shock, how the emergence of China affected labor markets in the US, it works quite differently in a model with global sourcing. And that's relevant because, yes, the US imported a lot of consumer goods from China. That's a big part of this. But there's a lot of US companies that went to China not to buy consumer goods, but to have parts of production done there. And from the point of view of the firms that went there, that was a positive shock. They went there, that reduced their costs, it expanded their scale of operation, which naturally led them to demand more inputs. And those firms, it's not very clear that are the firms that actually reduced employment in the US. And indeed, what we've shown in our work is that both theoretically and empirically, it's very clear that this China shock affected different firms very differently. Those that benefited from the China shock, they went, they cut costs, and we actually observed them growing their US employment. Now, on net, US employment was negatively impacted by the China shock, but that's to a large extent due to the fact that there's some firms that were small enough to not be able to benefit from that. So those guys faced more competition, and they had to shrink or close. But there's very rich effects behind the net that many economists have been emphasizing. And again, this heterogeneity in size and selection into importing is key for this. In other models, like models of snakes, but also spiders, the literature has shown that the cost of protection, this is going to be relevant for what I'm going to end with, are typically much higher in those frameworks than in traditional ones. And in my work with de Gortari, we've tied this to the notion that when you give up on trade in a world of sequential value chains, you're not just giving up on the ability to buy the finished product from wherever it's produced, you're giving up on the ability to get access to any of the value added that was contributed in any of the stages. If semiconductor production became fully domestic in all countries in the world, that would be a disaster. Think about, again, ASML, right? If people give up on ASML, how are they going to do the semiconductors? You can get infinite costs of protection unless you have some substitutes for things that you're going to need. So Filtered through a model, we found that just moving from one stage of production to 2 stages jacks up the gains from trade or the cost of protection by 60%. Okay, so again, if you're bothered by the small numbers that sometimes come out of quantitative models of trade, in part I think it's because they're missing this multi-stage nature of production. In other work related to policy with Ford, Gutierrez, and Tintelnot, we've looked at the optimal design of trade protection, if you're inclined to do so, and how it might vary by different types of goods depending on whether they're finished products or intermediate inputs. It's a very simple framework. It's just the beginning. There's much room for improvement. But we found patterns that are very much consistent with what we see in the data, which is if you are going to set tariffs, don't set them on inputs. If you are going to use tariffs, set them on consumer goods, not on inputs, which is in line with what we see in the data. We've seen that for most countries for many years in recent years, where indeed, except for Trump is the exception here. Trump, when they put the Trump tariffs, they were heavily loaded on inputs, which in our view is another reason why these policies were distortionary. They were not just raising tariffs at inefficiently high levels, but they were putting it on the wrong products. Okay? And think about that as the reason for that at a very loose level, as basically tariffs on inputs are just going to put sand in the wheels of this global value chains. They're going to hurt its efficiency. Okay? So that you really don't want to do that. That's on the theoretical front. Let me turn to the empirical challenges and the progress. Okay, so forget about the frameworks, kind of factual analysis, but simply measurement. How do we measure? How do we move away from the simple examples that motivated this literature and try to construct measures of what extent global value chains dominate trade flows? As I mentioned before, the first approach was the macro approach, which basically consists on estimating country/industry level contributions of value added to the country-industry level output of industries worldwide. How is that done? You rely on customs data, trade flow data, but you're also going to need other stuff. So we typically use input-output tables plus assumptions. And assumptions buys you a lot here. Okay, so again, huge admiration for the work that's done, for instance, by the folks in Groningen and all this stuff. But the way that I describe this world input-output tables to my students is I describe them, I don't want to offend anybody, but I describe them as sausages. Why sausages? Because they look good, they smell good. If you eat them, they really taste good, but you don't want to know how they made them. Okay? So that's a bit unfair to these guys because they spend a lot of resources making them. But there's a lot of calls on judgment on which assumptions do I make in building those tables. Okay, so there's much. You end up with something. This is a sausage. It tells me how each country industry is produced. You can see I'm a trade economist. I get excited by a table. But it basically gives me production functions. It tells me how cars in the U.S. are produced using inputs value added from various country and industry cells, and that I can map to models. It's very, very tempting. But it's problematic in many ways. So I would advocate really pushing on the firm level dimension. What's the challenge there? Well, the challenge is that we just don't have the data, right? We have a lot of firm-level information. It's not easy to get, but many countries have open customs data to researchers, census data, but we typically only get it for one country. So I was talking to folks here working with Dutch data. So you see firms in the Netherlands, they import, they export. You see those slices of the value chain, but I've been telling you that I want to think about how those decisions, those transactions are affected by other transactions, which is what happens after ASML sends the machines to Taiwan. We lose track of that. We don't know what they do with those machines. So how do we solve this? So the first thing you might do is work with what you have, which is some of what I've done, for instance, in the paper on spiders, work with Ford and Tintelnot, which is to say, I only have US data, US imports, US exports, but I'm going to interpret that data through the lens of a model that's just capturing that part of it. Even if it's the same data that other people are doing, I'm going to draw different lessons from that data. And I've given you an example of that before. So, you know, it's obviously what we often call a structural approach, where whatever data we don't have, we kind of really rely on the model to kind of tell me what's going to happen. But at least I think I'm interpreting the data in a better way than it's typically interpreted. So that's one approach. A more fruitful approach is to merge data sets. Have countries sign agreements to share customs forms so we can start tracing stuff when it crosses a border. Or rely on combination of data sources, like I'm going to tell you in a second, which is for the US. We not only have census data, we have the import data, the export data, but we also have surveys of the operations of US companies worldwide. We know what Ford is doing in Spain, in Germany, and other places. So we can merge that, and at least for firms that are headquartered in the US, we can see their, global operations. So that, again, we're not going to have multinationals from Japan, from the Netherlands, but it's, a bigger cut of the data that we can interpret through the lens of a model where all the countries are doing that. So that's going to, again, lead to probably more reliable inference. So very quickly, I'm now probably close to the 10-minute mark, I don't know, but let me give you a quick overview of this paper, just emphasizing specific things that I found interesting, okay? So the first one is this paper in the AER with Ford and Tintelnot, where all we did is work with US data, census data, manufacturing censuses, other types of censuses for the US. That's very important, for the Netherlands for sure as well, which is many firms, even in manufacturing, a lot of their value added is not in manufacturing anymore. They offshore the manufacturing stuff, they're doing innovation, and they're doing marketing and a lot of stuff. So it was important to merge all censuses so that we could see all the activities of Ford, of Apple, of all these companies. And then we looked at their exports and their imports. And we tried, in particular, focusing on the import side, we tried to have a model that accounted for what we observe, larger companies sourcing from more countries and things like that. And sort of estimate a model that minimized the distance between the model and the data and use it for counterfactuals. And the counterfactual I showed you with the heterogeneity of response to the China shock that's coming from this framework. But what I want to emphasize here is something much simpler, which is back in 2007, which is the year we used data for, we already observed and pointed out that firms in the US were not diversified. That is, if you looked at a particular input defined as an HS10 code input flowing into a US firm, the median firm in the US was buying that from only one country. Okay? Now, you might say today, that seems crazy, then what things happened with COVID, why didn't they diversify? Well, our model had a reason for this, which is there's fixed cost to creating those links. You're naturally going to have rationalized, sparse supplier network, because every time you create a link, you need to pay some overhead costs. You need to meet people, set up factories. That comes at a cost. So you're not naturally going to have 50 suppliers for the same part, which I think I'm going to come back to this. For policy, that's relevant. Just be careful in pushing for too much diversification, the risking, because that's not going to come for free. There's a reason why firms were not diversifying before. In the model, we were able to estimate this fixed cost of sourcing. So for instance, what comes out very clearly from our paper is China is a country where firms that operated there, they benefited massively in terms of marginal cost reductions. But we also estimated that there's a very non-significantly high cost of setting up supply chains there. Okay, maybe the language, the culture, whatever it is. That's the only way we could rationalize the fact that firms that source from China bought a lot from China, but not a lot of firms actually went there. There were many more firms going to Canada than to China, even though they were obtaining much lower marginal cost in China. So that there had to be something in the model that was making operating in China relatively costlier. So we loaded up on the fixed cost. The second solution is this paper where I told you we combined the data on the same data as in the previous paper, census, import-export data, but now that's combined with the survey data and the Bureau of Economic Analysis. For those of you that are in the literature, you've seen work going back to Lael Brainerd, Markussen, Yepel. Many people have used this data to shed light on the operations of US multinationals. For the first time, researchers in the last couple of years have had access to a data center in DC that combines those data. So we can now basically think about firms in the US as basically dividing them into US multinationals, that is firms in the US, headquartered in the US, that have foreign affiliates. They have foreign multinationals that operate in the US, okay? And then what we might call domestic firms that are maybe importing or exporting, but they don't have foreign affiliates or they're not owned by foreign. From that data, that's where we got figures of this type, showing you the massive granularity, which is that the bulk of activity, both sales and trade, is accounted for by multinationals. Other patterns we saw is that not only do you see these very large firms controlling trade, but it's not just the fact that they're very large. These same very large firms in the US that account for 75% of US sales, they have a lot of foreign activity. If you look at the US multinationals, these are their domestic sales, these are their foreign sales. This is a very, I don't know what the ratio is, close to 50-50. In fact, you can calculate that when US-based companies that were created in the US that we associate with US brands, when they make their, think about Ford, when they make their goods available to foreign consumers, what's the way that's done in traditional models? Exporting. They want my goods, I export to them. In the data, the way those goods are made available to foreign consumers is 4 times larger through foreign assembly than through exporting. Valencia, Ford plant, that's how you get the Ford cars in Europe. You don't get them from the factory in the US. 5 minutes, okay. So many more things I could talk about, and I'll skip this thing. Let me just quickly summarize and then get into policy super quickly. So basically what I've argued is multinational firms are dominant players in the world economy. You really want to think about what they do, not just their exporting, that input sourcing, global assembly. These are complicated, interrelated decisions, but we now have tools to kind of navigate those decisions and aggregate them up into models. And this generates interdependencies that are rich, but they're actually key in generating subtle counterfactual implications that might change how you want to think about how an economy is going to be shaped by shocks. I've tried to flag limitations as I went along. Let me just emphasize 2 very quickly. Although scale economies are key in those frameworks, there's something I don't like about how we've been modeling them, is that we treat them as fixed costs, when in reality they're not just fixed, but they're sunk. You go to Romania, you set up that supplier chain. If you were to pull out of Romania, you're not going to recoup that cost. I think that's very important. If I look at recent trade tensions, and I'll come back to it very quickly, that's the main reason why we have not seen more action coming out of the US trade-China trade war, where there's still quite a lot of imports from China. The second thing I'll point out is that even though we have models with imperfect competition, we're still sort of slaves to this monopolistic competition setting, whereas in reality, very often, there's so many few players in a given industry that you really want to think about oligopoly or even monopoly in the case of a SML. Okay, so treat with caution. You know, I know some of you are in the business of producing counterfactuals based on perfectly competitive roundabout models, caliendo paro models. That's great. We learned some from it, but don't take it as necessarily the truth. There's a lot of limitations in what we do. Thoughts on policy. I have 6 thoughts quickly, and then maybe happy to, if you'd rather talk about policy than about monotone comparative statics in the Q&A, I would understand it. So the first point, anticipated. We talk a lot about deglobalization, but if anything, what I see in the data is globalization. The ratio of trade to world GDP is not lower now than it was around the Great Recession. But it's true that it hasn't been growing as fast as it did in the 80s and 90s and 2000s. But maybe that's not surprising. Do you really think that the trade to GDP ratio should be a non-stationary variable? I'm not so sure. I think it's pretty natural that it had to stabilize. So that's the point here. Second point, COVID. You know, if you have concerns about the stability of the world economy, that even before this trade tensions, there was something very fragile. COVID dispelled this. When COVID came, the world economy, this data from CPV, by the way, the trade fell off a cliff, even more than GDP, but the recovery was very fast. So that, to me, was like very indicative. These are very resilient chains. Maybe the sunk costs are creating this glue that makes it really hard for firms to kind of move away, re-optimize. Okay, this was a big, big shock, but it was a temporary shock. So firms just played a strategy of wait and see. I think that's exactly the same reason why, with the US-China trade war, American companies didn't pull out of China right away. This is Trump, he's crazy, it's not going to last. Then Biden comes in, maintains the policies, now IRA. So, initially, not much reaction, but we not only have trade wars, we have geopolitical tensions, we have higher interest rates, we have much more demand for protection. So not surprisingly, we're starting to see, we're starting to see much more reorganization. We are starting to see how US imports from China are falling quite a lot, and US imports from other countries are growing. And it so happens that the US imports that are growing from Mexico, from Vietnam, these are the same countries where China is exporting more and more. So we're seeing a bit of a rerouting where Chinese value added is making its way into the US, but through this sort of roundabout way. But if the tensions continue, obviously we might see a much more, not just reorganization, but much more of a fragmentation and lower trade flows. US friendshoring policies may dramatically backfire. I'm really worried about this. There's this sense that the US can tell other countries whether they can trade with them or not. But if I look at world trade, the one thing that strikes me is for just about every country in the world, their main trading partner is China. So if the US wants to tell a country like Brazil or a country like Chile that they cannot trade with China anymore, I'm not sure they're going to follow through. So I do worry that this decoupling scenarios where we think about what would happen if China went its way, that is not the right way to think about it. From the point of view of the US, is a decoupling scenario might be one where the US and a couple of other countries go their way, and the rest of the world says we cannot live without China. So be careful with, I think that's not for, that's more for US policymakers, be careful about friendshoring. The risk in diversification is costly. Obviously, I've told you that firms were choosing sparse supply chain strategies. I think that has a lot to do with scale economies. So we might force firms to diversify, but they're going to face higher costs, higher prices, inflation. That's coming. And finally, I'm obviously worried about debt overhang and persistent high interest rates. In a world where you want to reorganize value chains, you want firms to incur large investments to shift stuff back to the US, back to Europe, with high interest rates, good luck making that at a low cost. But I'm way over time, sorry, so let me just stop here. Thank you.
See? Yeah, this
Yeah,
is the
you got
one,
it.
right. Thank you very much, Paul. This was super insightful.
Cool.
Let's go to the audience. There's now time for discussion, questions. Who would like to go first? There you go.
Yeah, thank you for the lecture. I had a question about the financial side of the global value chains that you described. Because in my sense, and I think it's something the BIS has published about as well, the longer value chains get, this increases financing needs, short-term debt, working capital, those kinds of things. Do you see in your work how these long value chains relate to financial instability or perhaps stability?
That's a tough question for me. So if you ask me about financial stability, I'm going to have a hard time giving you an informed opinion. there's certainly an interplay, and I didn't hear you perfectly well, but I think you pointed out the key aspect, which is buried in this sort of fragmentation of production and scaling up of all this stuff is the need for much larger cross-border financing than in the past. And a lot of these firms relied on internal capital markets to do that. That doesn't imply that they're sort of increasing the need for funding. And in some of the work that I've done is precisely trying to think about this. How do firms trade off this benefit of fragmentation, which is being able to benefit from getting access to suppliers that are particularly good at what they need and provide the least cost, and the fact that fragmentation is tending to increase this working capital needs because they kind of delay things a little bit. So I'm not too sure about the implications for that for fragility. That's the part that I'm missing. But it's certainly an aspect that I think needs much more attention. There's a close connection to the whole literature on the trade collapse of 08, 09, and how many people argued that part of the reason why the trade fell disproportionately more than GDP at that time was that this was a crisis that was financial in nature. So at the same time that demand was drying down, banks were in trouble, and they started cutting on their letters of credit and other instruments that folks argued were key for finance. I'm less sure that was that relevant. COVID was, we saw exactly that same disproportional fall in trade. But I've done some work on the trade, the finance aspects of trade and GVCs, but I think there's much more work to be teased out. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Esther Barendrecht. I was fascinated by your picture of the Dreamliner components.
With what? Sorry?
The Dreamliner components. The picture of the Boeing.
Yeah, Dreamliner, yeah.
So it seemed to me that every single component came from an allied economy. Is this something you recognize, and how would you explain it?
Let's take a look.
Live fact check.
I mean, so you may be right. If you're fascinated, I'm happy to leave it there. You're probably right. I mean, this is a fairly high-tech good. So, obviously that's going to limit the set of countries that you're going to tend to involve. Also, this is a Dreamliner. This is not the latest model. This was about 10 years ago, if not more, 15 years ago, I think. So if you're thinking about China or other Asian countries that could have been involved in it, it's a little bit harder to imagine that would be the case. If I had put up something like, sometimes I show a teardown report of an iPad. It's also an American product, Apple. But then the suppliers, obviously, we know it's assembled in China, but even the suppliers of other parts are less likely to be aligned. And, that's limited in the sense that this is a spider, but, to the extent that some of these things are made of copper, now we need to think about where the copper is coming from, right? Where's the copper coming from? Chile, Zaire or something? Zambia, that's right. Are these aligned countries? I mean, Chile, we think, I always thought about Chile as being an aligned country until I went to Santiago de Chile last year, and I talked to policymakers, and they're like, we don't know what we're going to do. I mean, if they force us to choose, we cannot give up exporting copper to China. I mean, this is our main buyer right now. So, my point is that the concept of what an ally is a fluid one. So I would worry about that. There's somebody there.
One thing that I was wondering about during your talk regards the optimization problem that you talked about at the firm level, which can be super complicated, right? And I was wondering, have there also been studies that looked like inside firms, how they actually solve these problems?
Good question. Sounds like a behavioral economist asking me.
Yeah, I'm afraid, yes.
I'm not sure there's any work, but that's something that I encourage my students to do. I mean, a natural pushback I would get when presenting these things is, you're telling me as if this firm was making this decision at once, and it's facing this complicated stuff. But Ford probably went first to Germany, and at some point they decided to add the Spanish plant. The academic economist answer would be, it could be staggered, but that still, you'd want to think about the whole plan ahead of time. So that doesn't really simplify matters, unless you start adding some rules of thumb, which is the way we operate is we think about one plant at a time, and then we do whatever's optimal at that point. And maybe that's because of financial constraints, the financial aspects that we cannot set up 5 plants at the same time, so we need to do that. I think that's great, but I haven't seen much work. Something that's doable is very interesting is, as you may know, some of these companies, they have very sophisticated supply chain departments. Their supply chain people are all engineers, they've done operations research. That's exactly what they deal with, the sort of big optimization problems. And they might be doing algorithms that are somewhat related to what we are doing, but there's still a bit of a gap, because we tend to put more structure on these problems because we're not trying to optimize the problem of a single firm with all its complexities. But there is a connection, and I fully agree that we might want to bridge that gap. Yeah. Is somebody there too? Here?
So I have a question about resilience. So it's one. So you find that some of these firms, they only have one supplier, and that's pretty risky. And then you point out that there's serious fixed cost to telling them to do more. But I was wondering, does your work shed light on where the risks, the supply chain risks particularly from a social point of view, and then allows for advice on how to, with minimum cost, solve them better than the firms themselves would know how to do that?
Not my own work, but good you asked this. You're alluding to something that if I hadn't been rushing at the end, I would have pointed out, which is, it's one thing to say that firms in 2007 were not diversified, and therefore that's the optimal thing to do, and policymakers should get out of the way. That's not what I meant to convey. But at the same time, I think policies that say COVID came and we started looking at semiconductors and we're worried about resilience, so let's just force everybody to diversify, this is very dangerous. What we need is exactly what you're suggesting, which is to think on an industry by industry dimension, to try to identify situations in which, for whatever reason, there's very sophisticated companies were making decisions that might have been privately optimal for them, but they were not internalizing some aspects that are socially important. Naturally, there's cases where it's obvious, right? So if a US firm was trying to sell nuclear warheads to Iran, I think the US government would step in and say, guys, I know there's money you can make, but that's bad for us. But in the middle, there's a lot of subtle things that we haven't figured out. There's some emerging work that is precisely trying to think about, in models like this one, are firms actually making sourcing decisions that are socially optimal? And in some of the work that I've done, the answer is yes, it's socially, there's no externality here. In some versions, there are externalities, but they're pretty subtle. Okay, so I'm not sure we have, as of today, something very tangible to say to policymakers, when you look at an industry, can you please look at these 3-4 things and be on a lookout for that? I don't think we have that, to be fair, to be honest.
Okay, we have time for 2 more questions. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Paul. Very interesting talk. I was wondering about the role of labor in all of these models. You know, one graph that you showed with all these flags basically also shows how many countries are now able to participate in international trade, and, you know, opening up them to new market, but also creating a lot of competition in terms of, you know, wages and stuff, and can also contribute to more labor mobility. You know, that might influence also when you open up a plant, point A, you might drive down wages, might drive it up somewhere else. That influences your demand as well. So is there room for labor in these models as well?
Good. So definitely there's a room for labor. I mean, this, at some level, just about every framework that I've talked about is actually a Ricardian model in the sense that labor is the only factor of production. Okay. Now, the key thing for what you're telling me is how much do I want to bring in general equilibrium forces? Okay, in the sense of the volumes of activity moving up and down, shaping wages. And that there's typically two types of work. There's some of the work that I've done, or some of the work on the macro side, the sort of roundabout models, they definitely have that dimension. Okay, because you want to make sure that if you have policies that massively move value chains towards a country or pull them out, you would expect that's going to have some effects on wages. And they're very much part of that in the background. And in fact, in those models, very often, labor is treated as a homogeneous input, homogeneous factor. So the only variation in real income is actually coming from wages. There's like inelastic labor supply. Okay? In other works, they're more partial equilibrium in nature. So you treat wages as kind of given, they're pinned down by other sectors of the economy. And those models speak much more about quantity. So our paper in the AER in 2017, that's what we did, and most of the action was on the level of manufacturing employment. What is the effect of the China shock on US manufacturing employment? There might have been effect on wages, although the work by Order, Dorn, and Hansen is not very conclusive on wage effects. But on the quantity front, we could see actually have implications for how many jobs were destroyed in the US due to the China shock. Good.
Thanks a lot for the presentation. Maybe a theoretical question, but which I believe has implications also for policy and other valuations. When we think of how global value chains come to be, should we think of a single firm making one decision of optimizing over different locations where to place plants, sourcing, etc., or is it more like, for instance, a production process and then different firms competing for having a seat at this production process? Because, for instance, in this graph, I see a lot of parts are part of Boeing, the company, but a lot of parts are other company.
Good. So that's a great question. I mean, there's two layers to that. I mean, there's first the simple point of, can I think about this as what the literature calls a lead firm approach? There's a lead firm that is sort of organizing the whole chain. And even if it's not the same firm that is doing those things, Apple does not own Foxconn, who's the assembler of Apple products, but it has a relationship where there's some power over that producer, right? So in other situations, industries might be more decentralized. So everybody's doing their thing, and you just buy from the cheapest source or something like that. Okay, so there's various ways to do that. In some settings, like my work with the Gortari, it turns out that it doesn't really matter. You kind of get like a isomorphism, but in models with scale economies, it would matter. Then the second aspect of all this is the organizational decisions. Do you want to have that be an integrated firm that is doing a bunch of segments, or do you want to rely on the independent suppliers? Okay, and that decision, I've argued when I had way less gray hair, and I spent a lot of time thinking about this, that you really need to think about the contractual aspects. It's all about incentives. Which are the organizational forms that are going to provide efficient incentives to producers in a world in which formal contracting is not allowing you to discipline behavior the way that you would, okay? And that's not something that I've connected back to with all this work. It's a little bit harder to get this within versus across firm dimension, but it's very important. And I go back to what motivated me to work in this area in my graduate studies, which is thinking about multinationals, looking at trade data, and realizing that 50% of US imports are transacted within multinational companies, not just Boeing buying from independent suppliers, but there's some, I have it here. So it turns out was it this Foggia, Italy? That's actually a linea. That's part of Boeing. Okay, that's a joint venture with Boeing. So some is internal or not, but when you aggregate the internal, it's 50%, which I always was shocked, right? Because when you think about trade, you go back to Ricardo or Tinbergen, by that matter. You think about the power of the world economy, the market mechanism in allocating activities to where they're most efficiently produced. Yet for 50% of what we buy in the US, we bypass the market mechanism. And we rely on companies governing those transactions, which is a little bit of a funny thing.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's give another round of applause. Yeah, and thank you. Before we let you go, we would like to offer you a present. It's actually a traditional present that all the economists that have given a Tinbergen lecture have received. And rumor has it that they also all have it in their office, actually. So let's see whether you also. So it's not really nicely wrapped, but that's more like. So this is the traditional macrame plate that has your name on it and the year and that you gave the Tinbergen lecture. So, well, we hope you enjoy it. There it is.
I wonder where it was made.
So thanks once more. And yeah, well, then it's time for a break. Enjoy the rest of the Nederlandse Economendag and see you later at the drinks.
It's really beautiful.